formerly was at, went to a federal court. The federal court said it sent chills down her spine, and she on the spot blocked all of the provisions that the law firm asked to be blocked, and excoriated the Department of Justice for defending this. But here's the deal, and this is the worst part, Brian, because as you point out, one of those law firms, Paul Weiss, the third law firm, went into the Oval Office and made a deal with Donald Trump. And what did Donald Trump do? He lifted the restrictions. But ask yourself, if Paul Weiss was a threat to national security because of the actions of Mark Pomerantz, the former partner, how did making this deal make them less of a threat to national security? Right? He lifted a bunch of sanctions that bore no relationship to the deal they made because Mark Pomerantz already wasn't at the firm. And so it was just out and out, I am the president, I can impose these sanctions, I can threaten you, you will come grovel. When you give in to me, I will bestow beneficence upon you. And it's an absolute disgrace that he did it. It is a worse disgrace that Paul Weiss went along with it. And my last thing is, and then I'll stop my rant, where the fuck is the rest of big law? Where the hell are the rest of the big law firms? Why aren't they standing up right now and saying, what you did to Perkins Coie is wrong, what you did to Covington Burling is wrong, and Paul Weiss, what you did, not only were you wrong, but you're even worse because you went along with it. And the silence that is deafening from the rest of the legal establishment is an absolute disgrace.
It bears a striking resemblance to the silence that really swallowed up the entirety of the media when the AP was being blocked from being able to go into the White House because they dared call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of Mexico and didn't ascribe to whatever fleeting whim Donald Trump had, and he wants to call it the Gulf of America. So now all of a sudden the AP has to change their style guide, but it's the same kind of silence.
And they're still being blocked in the White House. They're still right. Legacy media is still not standing up for them. Like it wasn't like remember in the first few days, and this does sort of parallel big law, right? Like in the first few days, you got a lot of bullshit out of the legacy media saying, well, we're working quietly behind the scenes and we have a strategy to help AP. That was all nonsense because AP still banned. And you know what? When you turn on the TV, and I'm not going to call out any particular anchor, but when you turn on cable news, you hear some of the legacy media refer to it as the Gulf of America because they have capitulated. And so here we are with the media as one of the pillars of democracy. Well, what's another pillar of democracy? Big law, right? The big law firms, the legal industry. Right. And the fact that you have a major law firm cutting this deal, betraying their principles. This is a law firm that has a long tradition of progressive politics. A lot of Democrats in that firm. A lot of Democrats, a lot of words from that law firm about how they support Kamala Harris and they support Joe Biden and Donald Trump's a threat. Well, here they are, bending a knee. They're bending knee so far, they can't even stand up. They're like in a permanent squat position now.
Yeah.
And by the way, what client wants to hire a law firm that is this compromised by doing this? But this is where we are right now.
Of any institution, one might think that that one that would be the most prone to engaging in litigation to fight for itself, to defend itself, would be a law firm, especially one as prominent as Paul Weiss. And so, look, you're composed of people who are better situated to fight against this than anybody else. If ever there was an institution or a company that could fight back against this, one might imagine that it would be them. And so why would they, of all people, decide to not only embolden Trump, but really sacrifice their own expertise in doing so?
Yeah, so it's one step worse than that, and then I'll answer your question. It's worse than that because Perkins Coie had already gone to court and won. So literally all Paul Weiss had to do was go to the same judge,
right,
and say, Your Honor, they've done to us exactly what they did to Perkins Coie. Yeah, they would have won.
Right. It's color by numbers at that point.
Right, exactly. So the question is, why didn't they? And the answer is because they're scared. Because they're scared that they will lose clients. They're scared that Donald Trump will exact further retribution. They're scared that clients will say, well, we don't want to hire a law firm that is on the outs with the Trump administration because Donald Trump may hire it. May hold it against us. And look, that is the kind of cowardice that is contagious. Like, it is that cowardice that is contagious. It is not just what Paul Weiss does. It is, what is the next big law firm going to do, and what's
Right.
the next big law firm going to do after that, and what about the law firms, like I said, that have not already been targeted, but who refuse to stand up and issue statements in support of Paul Weiss? What about the law firms that are cutting off doing pro bono that right now is much needed, but is fighting the Trump administration? Like this is the thing. Like, Paul Weiss made a decision that they can cut this deal and that it won't be too bad for them, because they'll suffer no harm economically. They may even benefit in the short term economically. But what it does to the rest of the legal field is it puts pressure on other big firms that then feel like they have to do the same thing. And then, Brian, when enough big law firms do it, the first one, Paul Weiss got a lot of outrage. The second one will get less outrage.
Right.
The third, the fourth, the fifth. Soon, it'll just be the normal thing for big law firms to do.
Right.
And they'll one after another follow it. And then what do you do if you are someone who is wronged by Donald Trump? Where do you go to find a lawyer?
Right. But he knows full well what he's doing. And so it's the same thing he's done to the big tech companies. It's the same thing he's done to the media companies. He knows full well that if he can get these people in line, to fall in line, the big people at the top, then there really won't be resistance among the smaller players. And so he chooses who he's going to go after deliberately. And that's what he did here. But then the flip side of that is that you have Paul Weiss not only undermining what they themselves purport to stand for, not only undermining the clientele that they've built up and the trust that they've built up among that clientele over the years, but they make it exponentially more difficult for the next law firm down the line to be able to stand up, knowing full well that there's no bulwark, that there's no appetite among their colleagues in the broader community to stand up against this.
Yeah, and I want to add two things to this. The first is that we also saw this among the Republican Party. You and I talked about this very phenomenon when Donald Trump was nominating his cabinet. And we talked about, why is he choosing Pete Hegseth, who's totally unqualified? Why is he choosing Tulsi Gabbard, who is literally an anathema to anyone any Republican who cares about national security? Yeah. Why is he choosing Kash Patel, who has a literal enemies list, to run the FBI? And one of the things you and I talked about is that he wanted to bring forward these terribly unqualified, odious nominees, because he knew that once he got Republican senators to vote for them, they wouldn't be able to oppose him on anything.
Right.
He'd own them on everything. And so in many respects, this is the strategy. Like you said, we saw with the business community, with the media, now with big law. We saw it with the Republican Party. He specializes on picking these fights to make the strong players. U.S. senators in the Republican Party, I would say, are among the strongest independent voices, or could be. They run only every 6 years, right?
Right.
But he picked on them because he knew if he got them in line, then would he ever face resistance?
Right.
If he got Mike Johnson in line, would he ever face a House that would stand up to him? So I wanted to make that point. But if you can indulge me for just 1 second about Paul Weiss, and I want to look very much in the camera and speak to partners at Paul Weiss. I grew up a Jewish kid on Long Island and then in Rockland County, New York. And when my parents would tell me about, being a lawyer, my parents, never achieved anything like being a partner at Paul Weiss. When they talked to my brother and I about us going to college and going to law school and really, achieving, they talked about places like Paul Weiss as a place that was a Jewish law firm, the first law firm in New York that hired Jews and non-Jews to work in the same law firm, and that had such a strong commitment to racial justice, to social justice, to being a critical part of the fabric of making sure that the least among us had legal representation, that made a showing at every opportunity of how generous they were to causes, and to make sure that women were promoted, and that African American lawyers had a way, and that this was part of who Paul Weiss was, and it was something that was very important. And I just have to say, as someone who's never worked at Paul Weiss, but as a Jewish partner in another city, from New York, it is especially painful to watch Paul Weiss, of all firms, bending a knee to Donald Trump. And not just bending a knee to Donald Trump, but among the things that Paul Weiss, you all agreed to do, is to do pro bono that Donald Trump agrees with